My name is James Tyree. I've always had a love for history, very much so, but primarily because my grandfather, he was raised when things here were still being done the way they were, in some cases 100 years earlier. He was born in 1914, and just his stories made me want to learn how to do that stuff. And of course, he always, why you want to learn that silly stuff, just like throwing out the corner cupboard so you can have a nice Hoosier cabinet. But it still set the foundation for wanting to learn the older ways, what was modern technology 200 years ago that unfortunately has been lost where we're so progressive in this country. And I've spent my whole life trying to learn that, traditional techniques in blacksmithing and woodworking, timber framing, stone masonry, more than I could ever hope to accomplish in a dozen lifetimes. We've done the easy part now. As long as we make sure, we'll say it's easy, it's not easy, but the first course is really the hardest. And that's getting our foundation plumb and level and then getting everything square. And that's what makes the rest of it easy as far as the pins themselves. Building these structures is not easy at all. I mean, there's obviously a lot of labor in it, but there's also a lot of research involved. And what I mean by that is when somebody comes into a new land, the first thing they're going to do is obviously find out where they want to clear for their structures, their house first of all. But then they've got to source material other than just your logs that you're going to build with, and that's where a foundation comes in. If you cut down logs and lay them straight on the ground, yeah, that might suffice for a very short time, but quickly moisture and termites, all kinds of pests, are going to destroy the structure you've built. So to stop that from happening, you have to find stone. That's the best thing for your foundation. Well, we are very lucky in this area that we have a huge amount of surface layer limestone that with a good hickory stick, you can actually pry it from the ground and it's already flat on top and bottom. So you don't have to have any stonemasonry tools at all. And you can take other rocks and cut these to a relative size that you want. There were so many trees here that they didn't care to waste trees. And so you would cut down a virgin poplar, let's say, that very possibly could have been easily 8 foot in diameter across the stump. And so when they felled these trees, they picked out the size of limbs or whatever that was the approximate size they wanted. And 10 or 12 inch in diameter is a size that just a few people can handle pretty easy and can go pretty high. You can actually climb with one that size. And so they would cut those limbs and such out, and then the rest of it would go to the wayside to either rot or later, if they got tools or something else, they would try to split that wood apart and get what they needed out of it. The barn we're building today is out of tulip poplar, which is native to this area and was very much used, 200 years ago, 250 years ago. It was a much easier wood to use, much easier to manage as compared to oak or the chestnut or woods like that. If you cut tulip poplar in the springtime, the bark is very easy to peel off, and bark had many, many uses. It was used for shingles on barns or houses, roofing material. It was used to make buckets, all manners of things out of the bark, whereas like the oak trees, they were very hard to harvest first off. The bark didn't come freely away from the wood, even though it was used for tanning. The bark was, but it was harder to get the material you needed. Poplar easily splits, so it was very easy to split material out to make floorboards or furniture or even shingles for a structure, a roof. It was easily carved to make watering troughs out of. It had the virgin timber had very tight grain. It was watertight. It didn't shrink or crack too much. Just had many uses all the way around. Utensils. It was just an all-around, all-purpose wood. We stripped the bark off, not that we're necessarily going to use all the bark for shingles on this particular project, but the bark naturally separates from the log due to bacteria between the bark and the log. It separates and it makes a house for all kinds of critters and creeksters and all that kind of stuff. So we stripped the bark off just to make this structure last a bit longer. That's the reason we don't see a whole lot of these period structures left. When they were built, nobody had the intentions of these structures lasting 200 years. They meant for them to last 10 years, they left the bark on. They didn't peel it off if they didn't need to, because that was extra work. You know, they needed to get crops in the ground or whatever. They spent as little time as possible. It was a necessity, not a want or a pleasure as it is today. So yeah, we strip the bark off. We will use some of the bark for buckets and shingles and such, but we're doing it for the longevity of the structure. And these are spring cut logs, which means they peel off very easy. Actually quite enjoyable to strip off. The part they're working on right now, making the plates for the top, which is what the rafters will sit on. Now that is really the most accurate part of the whole structure, because this is the part where we do absorb any inaccuracies as far as level and the tops of the pins. Once we get these plates on and they are leveled and trued, then the rafters are pretty easy going. You know, it's a simple A-frame with a gusset, you know, or a collar tie in between to hold in place to keep the thrust from, you know, kicking the roof out. Once we get the first one made and determine that it is correct, then that's the pattern. And the rest of them, you're just basically stacking them up and make it just like it. And then when we start raising them, and that's where the manpower comes in. You know, having to lift these green wood poles up and already assembled and hold them in place till they can be fastened in place. And once you get a couple of them in, then they hold each other up. You know, you've got scabs, as they call it, put on. And then we'll put on purlins, which is pretty easy except for the very top of the roof. Some little skinny monkey, and I've got a feeling it's going to be me, because I'm the last one here, gets to climb up on them slick poles and nail in the purlins, and then we'll put on the bark shingles, which once you got the purlins on, you've sort of got like a ladder to climb on, so that's not too bad. The top plates, if you'll notice, they're overhanging on each end. That's called a cantilever. Obviously, that is to help keep the water away from the foundation, and which helps keep it dry on the inside and not as much disease issues and such as that. Unfortunately, the material we can get today, it's hard to find a piece that's long enough to go the whole length of these two cribs as well as the cantilevers. So we have to put several pieces together to make up that length. And we're doing this by use of a lap joint, which simply means they lap on top of each other. We'll cut out X amount of material from one and cut out that same amount of material out of the other, and we'll, using hand augers, we'll bore holes through and just simply peg it together. Now, how this works, you might ask, why does this not slide out from the roof thrust? The plates are green. The pegs going in place are dry. So as this material dries, the plates, they shrink around the pins, and it actually acts like a vise, a peg in a vise. It squeezes down on it, and it won't allow it to flex. This is called a two-pin barn. They were very common in this area. Anyway, what two pins means, you have two separate structures, you know, built out of log, of course, and to tie those together so they have a shared roof, one roof covering all of that, we have what's called plates. Plates go up on top, and the rafters actually sit down on those plates. All right, so there's several reasons in that. One reason is it's a lot easier to build one roof than it is to build two separate roofs. And with these two pins close together, you've got it under one roof, and you've got a breezeway through the middle. That helps any moisture that might build up, air passing through to make that evaporate. It helps keep livestock cooler. If you have them in the pens, and traditionally it would have been hogs in the bottom. And then you would have your hay or oats or whatever up top. That helps keep that mold free. So there's several reasons in building it this way, but simplicity is really one of the main reasons. You know, you don't have to cut as much material when you're doing one shared common roof. It's easier to tie all the shakes together. Your roofing material, be it bark or slabs or shakes, shingles if they're sawn, which they wouldn't have been in this area. It's easier to tie them together under one roof at the same time than it is to build two separate and later come back and join the roofs. So it's just all about being easy. People were just as lazy then as we are now. You know, the easiest way they could find to do it that served the purpose, that's what they done. The myth that pioneers, you know, come walking into a new piece of property on the frontier or the backwoods, you know, they come in carrying an axe and the tools to set up a house and all that is absolute rubbish. That is not true at all. Now, there were cases where they did come in to a place and they did have these. But first off, tools were extremely expensive at that time. And these people that were coming in the frontier, very few of them were wealthy. They were coming into the frontier for a reason. There was no law. The British had no rule in this area at that time. You know, the natives were the only law, really. So they were coming here where they didn't have to pay taxes or such things. So it was poor people at first. So what would follow, you might have somebody come in and they do establish a small little settlement, you know, 3 or 4 cabins or something like that. Well, Christ people and tradespeople, Christ people in particular, timber framers to be exact, you know, they were coming over here to make their fortune just like anybody else. Well, they had the tools. After they went through an apprenticeship, typically that was part of the apprenticeship. When you finished, you left with a set of tools where you could start into business. So they followed these people. Had to be enough people there to justify them coming there, but they followed these people. And you know, come into a community, let's say here, for instance, there might be 4 or 5 families set up and they come rolling in, would you like for us to build you a barn or something like that? That's when you start seeing the nicer buildings. What would have been made first, they might have had an axe or something like that, likely would have had some, maybe a worn out one. They would have built something very crude and very rough. No logs were hewn using what's called a broad axe, which is not an axe you would use to chop down a tree. It was an axe used to make very clean, flat surfaces. Originally, the first structure would have not had any hewing done to it at all, because the felling axe it was an expensive tool, but it was cheap in comparison to the more specialized tools such as a broad axe or a goose wing hewing axe, such as that. So they wouldn't have had it. They couldn't have done it. And this structure was meant to be a short-term structure anyway, so there was no need in making sure the roof set down good and flat or the joints were perfectly sealed tight together. They didn't care. It was a rush job to get it done. We are hewing the top plates in this case, which are what the rafters set on. We are hewing those flat. We're doing that for the purpose of longevity. We want this structure, you know, to last as long as it possibly can. We're working real hard to do this, and we want everybody to see it. We want everybody to learn about these structures. So we are putting a little bit more into it than what would have been traditionally speaking.